All right, so welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time we're looking into a pretty major Supreme Court decision.
Mm-hmm.
It concerns this whole thing with the Trump administration and the decision to let go of thousands of probationary federal workers.
Right.
And for this deep dive, we're mainly going off a really in-depth report we found from NPR.
Okay.
So the idea is to kind of break down all the legal stuff so we can all understand, what happened, the different arguments involved,
Yeah.
and basically what it all means, for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. This isn't just some abstract legal thing.
Right.
It really gets at the heart of like executive power and, what kind of protections federal workers have and how we can even challenge actions the government takes.
Yeah, so let's get into it.
Yeah. Let's dive in.
So the big news dropped on Tuesday, April 8th, 2025.
Right.
And essentially what happened is the Supreme Court said, okay, the
Right.
Trump administration can, at least for now, move ahead with firing something like 16,000 federal employees. But here's the thing that makes this whole thing really interesting.
Okay.
They didn't actually rule on whether these firings were legal.
Yeah. That's the key point here.
Yeah.
The court didn't actually look at whether the firings themselves were justified or not. What they focused on was this legal idea of standing.
Oh, standing. Yeah. It's one of those legal terms that could use a little explaining.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you break down what it means in this case?
Basically, standing means that if you're going to sue someone,
Right.
you got to show you were directly and specifically harmed by whatever you're suing over.
Okay.
So in this case, it was a 7-2 decision.
Okay.
Justices Sotomayor and Jackson disagreed with the majority.
Hmm.
But the majority of the court said that while, yeah, these nonprofits might see some indirect effects
Right.
from fewer government services because of the firings,
Huh.
they weren't directly harmed in a way that was specifically connected to these employees losing their jobs.
Okay, so even if these nonprofits think that they're going to be negatively affected because there are going to be fewer people working in these federal agencies,
Yeah.
the court is basically saying that that's not a good enough reason for them to sue over the firings?
Exactly. That's it.
Okay.
Their reasoning was basically that, employment disputes
Right.
should be between the employer and the employees,
Makes sense.
which, in this case is the federal government.
Yeah.
And the government argued, and the majority of the court agreed, that these nonprofits were basically trying to stand in for the employees without a solid legal basis to do that.
So this ruling, it allows the firings to continue for now.
Yeah.
But it was really specific, right?
Right.
It only applied to these particular nonprofits in this lawsuit.
That's right. Yeah, the opinion from the court specifically said their decision was just about whether these nonprofits could sue.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that they basically left the door open for other people or groups who might be more directly harmed to challenge these firings in court.
So even though the Trump administration is probably seeing this as a win in their effort to make the federal government smaller
Yeah.
and, give more power to the president, we still don't know for sure whether these firings were actually legal.
That's a really important point.
Right.
And, when we think about the bigger picture,
Yeah.
this decision could make it a lot harder for advocacy groups who are concerned about cuts to the government workforce to fight those cuts in court. From now on, they'll probably need to show much more clearly that they themselves are being directly harmed to even bring a lawsuit.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit.
Sure.
And look at what led to these firings.
Yeah.
What did the administration actually do?
Well, it started with an executive order from President Trump
Okay.
back on February 11th. The NPR report doesn't say exactly what year this was, but it seems like it was pretty recent.
Right.
And after that, the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM,
Okay.
which basically handles all the HR stuff for the federal government.
Right.
They send out instructions to all the federal agencies telling them to fire all probationary employees.
All of them.
Well, except for the ones they considered essential.
Okay, so just for folks who might not be familiar with this,
Yeah.
what exactly is a probationary employee in the federal government?
So usually these are either new hires
Okay.
who are kind of on a trial period. They could be like 1 or 2 years. Or sometimes it's people who've worked for the government for a while, but they've moved into a totally new role.
Okay.
And this probationary period gives agencies time to see if these employees are doing a good job
Makes sense.
and if they're a good fit for the position before they get all the same job protections as permanent federal employees.
So this order from OPM,
Yeah,
it caused a lot of disruption in the federal workforce.
it did.
The report says that tens of thousands of probationary workers ended up being fired from all sorts of agencies.
Right. And the report gives some specific examples,
Okay.
like the Departments of Veterans Affairs, Agriculture, Defense, Energy, Interior, and Treasury.
Wow.
So you can really see how this affected a lot of really important parts of the government.
Yeah, and of course, all these firings led to legal challenges.
Of course.
We talked about the nonprofits,
Right.
but the report also mentioned that federal workers' unions got involved.
They did.
So what were the main arguments against these firings?
So both the unions and the nonprofits were making legal arguments.
Okay.
And their arguments basically boiled down to two main points.
Okay.
First, they said that OPM didn't actually have the legal right to order all these firings.
Mm-hmm.
They said that decisions about firing people should be made by each individual department or agency
Right.
based on, how that employee was performing or what that specific agency needed,
Makes sense.
not through this kind of blanket directive from a central HR office like OPM.
Yeah, it's like who has the actual power to make these big personnel decisions?
Exactly.
So what was the other main argument?
The second big argument was about the process of the firings.
Okay.
The groups challenging the firings said that the government didn't follow the rules for firing probationary workers.
Mm.
Like they said the employees weren't given enough notice about why they were being fired,
Right.
and they didn't have a fair chance to respond.
Okay.
And they also claimed that the government didn't give enough notice to state and local governments,
Right.
which, could be seriously affected when you suddenly lose all these federal jobs in their communities.
Yeah, so these lawsuits went to court.
It did.
And there were some initial rulings at the district court level, right?
Right.
What happened there?
So the first lawsuit ended up in the district court for the Northern District of California.
Okay.
And the judge was William Haskell Elsop.
Okay.
And he made a really interesting initial decision.
Mm.
He agreed with the government that the unions didn't have standing to sue,
Okay.
which, kind of foreshadowed what the Supreme Court would later decide.
Right. Okay.
He came to a different conclusion about the nonprofits.
Okay.
He actually said that they did have standing to sue.
Interesting.
His reasoning was that these nonprofits rely on all sorts of government services
Right.
to do their work.
Uh-huh.
And because these firings were reducing the capacity of government agencies,
Right.
it was directly making it harder for these nonprofits to do their jobs.
Okay.
So he saw a more direct connection between the firings and the harm to the nonprofits
Right.
than the indirect connection that the unions were claiming on behalf of their members.
And so based on that, Judge Alsop took a pretty big step, right?
He did. After a hearing, he actually ordered the reinstatement of federal employees at 6 different departments:
Okay.
Agriculture, Defense, Energy, Interior, Treasury, and Veterans Affairs. He basically agreed that OPM couldn't just tell agencies to fire all these people,
Right.
and said that those decisions should be made by the departments themselves.
Okay. So the government obviously didn't agree with this.
No, they did.
And they appealed it.
Yeah.
What was their main argument when they went to the higher courts and finally to the Supreme Court?
So their counterargument had two main parts.
Okay.
First, they said that OPM wasn't actually ordering agencies to fire people. They said they were just giving guidance on how to carry out the president's executive order.
Okay.
And they said that each agency made the final decision about who to fire based on what they needed.
Okay.
And then second, they argued that no matter what OPM's role was,
Yeah.
the firings were legal under the existing rules for federal employment,
Right.
especially for probationary employees.
Okay.
So when the case got to the Supreme Court, the government really pushed this idea of standing,
They did.
especially for the nonprofits.
Yeah.
They kept saying this was basically an employment dispute between the government and its workers.
Right.
And they argued that the nonprofits had no business bringing this lawsuit on behalf of the employees, seeing that the employees themselves had ways to challenge their firings individually within the system that's already in place for federal employment disputes.
Right.
The government's position was that each employee's situation was different
Okay.
and should be dealt with on its own,
Yeah.
not through some kind of group action by these outside organizations.
And as we know, the majority of the Supreme Court ended up agreeing with the government
They did.
on this question of whether the nonprofits could even bring the lawsuit.
Right.
But it's so important to understand that the court specifically avoided saying whether or not the firings themselves were actually legal.
Absolutely. That's the key point here.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court's decision to let the firings continue for now
Right.
is only about who has the right to file this particular lawsuit,
Uh-huh.
not about whether those firings were legal under the law.
Okay, so that question is still up in the air,
It is.
which means there could still be more lawsuits.
Exactly. The Supreme Court made it very clear that their decision doesn't stop other people or groups
Okay.
who might have a stronger case for standing from suing the government over these firings in the future.
Mm-hmm.
This could be individual employees going through the usual channels for federal employment disputes,
Right.
or maybe even other types of organizations that can show they were directly harmed by the firings.
And the NPR report mentioned another case happening in the lower courts
Yeah?
down in Maryland.
Uh,
Can you tell us about that?
so while the Supreme Court was dealing with the lawsuit from the nonprofits,
Okay.
there was this other legal challenge going on in Maryland.
Hmm.
This one was filed by 19 states and the District of Columbia.
Wow.
And they're trying to get employees reinstated at more than 20 federal agencies.
Okay.
And the report says they've actually had some success so far in the lower courts.
Interesting. So what might make these states' argument for standing stronger than the nonprofits?
Well, the states involved in the Maryland case might have a stronger argument because they can say that these firings are directly hurting their interests as states
Okay.
and hurting their citizens. They could argue that because there are fewer federal employees, they're having trouble providing essential services to their residents or enforcing state laws
Right.
or even just working with the federal government on things they're supposed to be doing together.
Yeah.
So that's a much more direct kind of harm than what the nonprofits were claiming.
Okay, so to sum all this up,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court's decision means that for now, the Trump administration can go ahead with firing these thousands of federal workers.
Right.
But this decision was really just about whether the nonprofits that filed this particular lawsuit had the right to do so.
Yeah.
The court didn't say anything about whether the firings themselves were legal or not.
Right. And that's still a big open question.
It is, and it's being fought out in other courts,
Right.
like in that case with the states down in Maryland.
Exactly.
So this whole thing really shows how complicated it is when you have the powers of the executive branch and the laws about federal employment and the role of the courts in figuring out these big disagreements.
It does.
It also shows how even something that seems like a technical legal detail,
Yeah.
like standing,
Wow.
can have huge consequences in the real world.
Because it determines who can even go to court to challenge what the government is doing.
So what does all this mean for our listeners?
Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty clear reminder that when a new president comes in,
Right.
it can really shake things up in government agencies.
It can.
And not always in ways you might expect. And this case shows that even decisions about who gets to keep their job
Yeah.
can turn into these huge legal battles
That's right.
with
Yeah.
big implications for federal workers and for all the important services the government provides.
It really makes you think.
It does.
Like, even though the Supreme Court decided not to rule on whether the firings were actually legal,
Right.
what other arguments could people make in future lawsuits?
Yeah.
And what could happen if those arguments win?
Mm-hmm.
Could it change the balance of power in the government?
What about the rights of federal workers?
It's a situation that's definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Absolutely.
Things are still developing, and who knows what could happen next.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.